So in June of 24, the FBI and Alert issued their new report rounding up the data on active shooter events from 2023. And there is some interesting information in here. There's also data from the Gun Violence Archive and numerous other databases. But here's the question. When you're the police officer, the firefighter, or the paramedic that gets the dispatch and you're responding down the road, does the data matter? That's today's topic. Stick around. Welcome to the Active Shooter Incident Management Podcast. My name is Bill Godfrey, your podcast host. I am joined here by three of my fellow instructors at the National Center for Integrated Emergency Response. Juan Atan, back in the house. Juan, good to have you.
Thank you.
Adam Penley on our law enforcement side.
Yes, glad to be here. Thank you.
Good to have you. And then we got Kobe Breen back in the house, who, of course, covers kind of all the disciplines. It seems a little unfair. You're being greedy over there.
Do what I can, sir.
All right. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about data, which is normally an eye-glazing type of exercise. But we spend a lot of time in the data and, in fact, talking about how that can inform some of the processes and some of the systems. And so I want to kind of hit on a few of the interesting things that we've seen here in the data, some changes, some things that haven't changed, and talk about that. But then I want to spend some time talking about what does and doesn't really matter to the responders and why. Adam, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. So, I think some of the things that we've seen that have kind of remained the same or have reemerged after, 2020 was an odd year just because a lot of numbers were different because of the COVID time, right? But since then, some of the numbers have kind of gotten back where they went, which so there's a couple things that I think inform responders and training and the way we put the checklist process together, and that is that you can expect firearms to be involved, and of those firearms, it's most often a handgun, right, is your most common weapon type. But then behind that is rifles and shotguns. That number, and then the idea of your shooting locations, that number is kind of has changed slightly. People think or we assume that schools, because they're the most impactful, but they're not the most common. Places of business, commerce, those are the most common. But outdoor locations, outdoor scenes have started to see an increase a little bit. And then just the definitions. And I think the understanding of how some active shooting situations are defined versus a mass killing versus motive, all create some interesting data points that we need to know about in the way we plan our responses. Like, for example, another common misconception, from a public movie standpoint sort of way, is that body armor or IEDs aren't used very often, 4% for body armor and even a lower percentage for IEDs or other types of improvised weapons. So you say all that to say that the one thing that we do talk about when we talk about why the data matters is that the training that law enforcement does around the country in most situations is going to be adequate to get in there and stop the threat. We are not fighting SEAL Team 6 and some sort of advanced weaponry. We are fighting, a single shooter who's decided that today is going to be their terrible day, and we can get in there and stop that, right? So that's what the data tells me in a confidence sort of way. But then after that, the response is going to be very similar, based on the way you just have to enact your training.
It's an interesting reality. I mean, Kobe, you've been teaching and training and working through this stuff as long as all of us, and seeing this data shift over time. Fundamentally, what are the couple of things that jump out at you that you think would inform the way you train or the way you teach, things that we ought to pay attention to?
So it can go, we can break it all down into locations. Schools are obviously not the big one. So we're working on schools. So let's look at where the most common things are. So it's just giving you what the stats are saying, what is the most likely place? Because if you go to schools, you have to deal with what are our access procedures? How can we get into the classrooms? How can we get into certain areas? Same way with businesses. Are there ways to get in through there? Like, the try before you pry kind of thing. If we have to breach doors, or how do we gain access? Do we just simply grab the access cards? What are the layouts of it? What do the windows look like for the outside? Are insides marked versus outside marked as far as for perimeters to be around? So the more we progress, the more of those those things are getting caught up to us, which is helping us. So it's all lessons learned from previous events. And that's where I think the more and more we break this down and look at this, that gives us the answers to what's happened in the past. And it kind of tells us where the likely locations are, what are they likely armed with, where are they this, and this. But, and all of it, it really sums up to it doesn't matter. It's just we're there. We're dealing with the best case scenario, and let's deal with the best case practices that the previous events have told us, and make it fit to this circus or paradigm that we're dealing with here in front of us.
Sure. So Juan, the data. There's a lot of information and statistical data in here, but one of the things that's not very well informed upon is the nature of the injuries, the type of the injuries, the severity of the injuries for the medical side. Is that a gap, you think? Is that something that we would be better off if we could figure out how to get it?
Yeah, I believe there's a gap because, again, being on the fire EMS side, you would like to see what kind of injuries were involved in these type of incidents. It is great that we know where it happened, in which locations, what was the gunman, doing? Did he have body armor? All that is great information on the law enforcement side. But bring it over to the fire EMS side. Hey, what are the injuries? What were the causes of the injuries? Were they salvageable injuries that a tourniquet could help this person out? And it could have helped the fire EMS side. I mean, it is great information. Don't get me wrong, but it leaves that little gap there. Like, okay, what do we have to be looking for in these type of emergencies? It's a shooting. We know we're going to have people shot in the leg, chest, head, whatever the case may be, but are they survivable injuries for this type of event kind of thing? Yeah. So,
and some of that may be data that kind of underlies the other thing that we teach is that you're not only fighting the criminal, but you're fighting the clock. So to Juan's point about survivability, and that might be a hard number to really, that people might not want to hear, and there have been some follow-on studies in some shooting situations that, hey, there were some that were shot that had they been transported more quickly, they might have survived, right? And that's a tough number to hear. But some of that data, if we're going to look at data points and how you prepare and how you train, that could be a gap that could be filled with additional data.
It's an interesting tangent to the conversation. Of course, on the military side, Kobe, I know you're familiar with these studies. Years and years ago, the military began looking at battlefield fatalities and saying, was this fatality preventable? And came to be known as tactical combat casualty care, where they came up with a set of guidelines and they would look at the fatality reports, the autopsy reports, and determine whether somebody had potentially survivable injuries. Somebody that died had potentially survivable injuries. How did that inform battlefield medicine? Because I know you lived through some of that when you were deployed. How did that inform battlefield medicine? And what, if anything, can we take away from that practice on the civilian side?
It looked at what the most common injuries were. What were the common factors leading to combat-related deaths? And it all broke down into several that were, and then what was treatable. There's the outcomes of war or any conflict is one better way to win through injuring the opponent, and the other aspect of that is ways to treat the injuries that weren't that are survivable, and the best ways to come up with that. And that led to tactical combat casualty care, which in turn led to the tactical emergency casualty care guidelines,
which is the civilian,
which is civilianized version of it. Yes, both very adept at what they do. And tactical combat casualty care just looked at all of it, like the stats, the research of what were people dying from, and how can we train not just the one medic, the unit medic that's taking care of it, but train everybody else. You're your own first responder. The guys to the left and right of you are the ones that are going to be coming, and how can we best prepare them for the inevitable, the worst day of dealing with those injuries, instead of just waiting for that unit, that specialized units to come in. Let's train the true first responder, which is you, the boots on the ground, and how to identify that and the easiest ways to treat those injuries.
And I think the remarkable thing about that story is the proof is in the pudding.
Yes.
They have reduced battlefield fatalities very, very dramatically by applying this. And unfortunately, it's something we kind of miss in the civilian side because we can't get the autopsy reports. We can't do this analysis, medical confidentiality, privacy, all important things. I'm not trying to say they're not important, but it deprives us of the ability to learn. And one of the things that concerns me is, the TCCC looked at, I think the biggest single loss of preventable life was uncontrolled hemorrhaging, uncontrolled bleeding, which led to the advent of tourniquets being used in the battlefield, which saved a lot of lives. That then got applied to the civilian active shooter environment and caused us to do roll out nationally tourniquets for police officers, things like that. And that training and those tourniquets have absolutely saved lives.
Oh, correct.
Not very many in active shooter events, but it turns out that they've had an enormous life-saving effort on the other side. And when you look at the nature of the injuries, you have injuries from the rifle rounds and ballistic injuries, but you also had a lot of IED injuries in the battlefield that we don't see in civilian active shooter events. And the rifle round in a battlefield is typically a distance away, whereas it's up close and personal, whether it's a rifle round or a bullet. And those both have different mechanisms of injuries. I wish that there was a path forward, and it would require legislation that would undoubtedly be controversial, unfortunately. But I wish there was a path forward for us to study what's going on.
No, absolutely. Because again, looking at these numbers, like as mentioned, is great. You see these incidents that happen, and you see like a number just throwing out 31 casualties. How many of those 31 casualties died? How many were survivors? Just see a number. What were their injuries?
Right.
So that we have a better understanding, all first responder, these are the type of injuries you might be seeing. Not the same like you were talking about in the battlefield, because in the battlefield is a whole different game itself. They got IEDs, they have the, rifles, bomb, you name it. But in an active shooters, it's a whole different, but we would like to see those injuries. So that way, when we train, we know what we're kind of training. Where in the military, you're training for, every case is a worst case scenario, but in the battlefield, it's a very worst case scenario, where here it's very different. So again, the numbers, they're great for us, but hey, tell us, who survived it, who passed, who died, what were their injuries, were they mutilated, kind of thing. So that way we have a better idea of what we're getting to. And then when we train for that mindset.
Sure. And it might be good to see also that, to correlate between responses that maybe did have a better or faster RTF response and was the survivability better in some of those incidents as opposed to areas that might have had some challenges. And I know you can get those like looking at some individual after action reports and some different things, that we review those as well. And again, we've said this many times, it's never meant to second guess anyone's response. It's just meant, how do you build a path forward from there based on what you know? And, to switch gears a little bit, Bill, the other thing that really jumps out at me from preparing your law enforcement response is how the shooter, the outcome of the shooter themselves, and those numbers. And it's common that people think, well, they all end in suicide, or a great majority of them end in suicide, and that's not the case.
Not anymore. 5 years ago, the percentage of these things ending in suicide was substantially higher than it is now. It's less than, it was 40-something% just 5-6 years ago, and now it's been cut by more than 50% of it. It's half of that.
Right.
Down into 25.
The number one thing is that they're apprehended, right? So they're and then second, apprehended, then suicide, but then very close behind suicide is that they are killed by police. And then if you add the number of suicides that they've committed suicide as police are arriving. If you add that number to the killed by police number, it's actually higher than the suicide number. So I say that to say that this really ties into law enforcement training. Is we have to get our officers to understand that what you're learning and how you respond and how you give a good size up report and your follow-on officers, all of those are critical because you're going to have to take action. And fortunately, the number of officers injured or killed in active shooter events has stayed relatively steady, but we've seen those numbers. Those numbers are real, right? So training is important. Understanding that your actions matter is important, and that it's going to take a law enforcement response to end most of these things.
I think the other thing that we need to bring into the conversation, I think this is hugely important. So this particular report that we're discussing here, the one that FBI and Alert put out, and they do this every year, and it's great stuff, and I'm very appreciative of the work that they do. But we go back to just post Columbine on this data set, and it runs through. I'm trying to remember the numbers off the top of my head, and I think the numbers I've got in my head run through 2022, not including the data of this report. But it's like 460 active shooter events over the last 20 plus years since we started tracking this stuff. And what's very interesting to me is what gets excluded because of the definition of what an active shooter event is and isn't. And you mentioned a couple of these earlier, Adam. I want to revisit that. You mentioned mass killing. So there's another FBI report that defines the mass killing as 3 or more killed. But then the Gun Violence Archive, which is a private group that tracks gun violence shootings here in the U.S., their definition for mass shooting is 4 or more shot, not including the attacker, the shooter. And here's what's fascinating is they've got data from 2021 to so far in 2024. It looked like it was only up to a couple months ago. They've got over 2,000 cases. So we're 460 something active shooter events with the air quotes over a 20 plus year span. But in a 4-year span, 21 to into here to 24, not even a complete 4 years, we've got 2,000 mass shootings where 4 or more people were shot. And a lot of that data obviously doesn't end up meeting the academic definition of an active shooter event. And this is where I want to kind of take a little bit to talk about this, because for the responder, I'm not sure the academic definition matters a whole lot. If there were 4 or 5 or 6 people shot because it was a family argument, a backyard barbecue, and there's people running everywhere and bodies everywhere, how am I going to approach that?
Right. Yeah. Well, some of the same skills are going to become vitally important. And that's what I was going to say is that,
I mean, you're still going to think that that's an active shooter until proven otherwise, right?
Right.
Same posture.
From a definition standpoint, the difference is often motive. So one data set says that it has to be indiscriminate stranger killing, with no other motive than that, whereas mass killing can be people that know each other. And, I remember responding to an incident some years ago where it was a large outdoor party and 2 individuals got in a argument with each other and shot at each other, but the result was 14 people being shot that were around them. But to your point, Bill, is that as you're responding to that, the motive doesn't matter. You know that you have people that are shooting, you have innocents that are going down, and you have to get in there and stop that active threat, build a response in the chaos of what's going on, and the same skills that you would use to something that's defined as an active shooter by dispatch is the same whether it's a mass shooting, an active shooter event, an unknown type of shooting with multiple people down. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, Kobe, we've seen this unfortunately far too many times. The high school football game, 2 groups get into an argument, and a couple of people pull out guns and start shooting, or one person pulls out a gun and starts shooting, and then people get indiscriminately hit. You're a cop going into that. What are you thinking?
It really doesn't matter. You're probably really not going to know it's a planned event till afterwards, till the post investigation happens. All you know is there's a lot of people injured. You don't take your skills learned from, let's just say, from a active attack, active shooter class. You can't house those skills up because your definition doesn't meet it. Oh, it's a family barbecue. It's a gathering. It's just him versus him or her versus her kind of thing. And then we have the collateral damage. It doesn't matter. I still need to, one, stop the killing, apprehend that, stop that from the injuries happening. I have to stop the bleeding from happening or the death from happening, stop the dying. And then three, what's the third thing, is we want to get them to the highest priority or highest level of care beyond the parking lot that we're currently operating in or whatever our collection area is and get them going. So the skills are transferable across the shift of the event. It's just the reasoning that those people are in front of me is for the investigators to figure out, or what actions led up to them. It doesn't matter if they were put there by a planned event or a non-planned event. And I mean an active shooter event versus just a happenstance event, a planned active attack event. It doesn't change my response to it. I still am doing the best I can with what I have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's still the same priorities, is it not? Number one is threat. Number two is rescue the injured. Number three is clear and restore security.
I'm assuming their injuries are the same, no matter what the motive was.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And going to your point, I mean, these numbers are fantastic and everything, but again, the response is going to be the same. Somebody's got shot, multiple injuries. We're going to get there. We're going to take care of business. Like Kobe was saying, we're going to take care, get the active threat, neutralize them as much as possible. We're going to take care of the injuries and take them to the higher level. I mean, the numbers are great for us, to have them and see, okay, these are things that happen. But at the end of the day, these events happen 24/7, give or take. Is our responses going to change at midnight, or is it going to change at 5 o'clock in the morning, or? No, we're going to respond accordingly. I mean, the data shows that different days, different hour, things happen a little bit more. But do we know when the tones go drop or you get dispatched? Are we going to change No, we're going to go and take care of business.
I mean, Adam, are we seeing an inflection point where, again, from the responder's point of view, I understand from an academic point of view and a research studying point of view, you've got to define these things and you've got to put them in the buckets and then you got to dissect the data. But from a responder's point of view, are we at an inflection point where we should be talking about a standard response package that is dispatched when a call hits a certain threshold? And when I say that, I mean, we've got reports of multiple people shot.
Right.
Don't know whether it's an active shooter or not. We're going to assume it is, trigger that response that's a minimum package of law enforcement, including supervisors.
Right.
It's going to be a minimum package of fire, minimum package of EMS. That's all going to go to the scene and execute this response process, this response posture until they deal with any threat, rescue the injured, and clear and restore safety and security.
Sure. And I think those two things go hand in hand. Having a response protocol and having the discipline and the training to dispatch those packages right from the start, and knowing that there's going to be different roles along the way. What you don't want is, in a movie sort of way, having dispatch say, everyone available, go, right? Because you're starting your response with chaos before you even had a chance to even get there. So the advantages of having a defined package, and we've talked about this many times before, of having your dispatchers participate in this training so they can recognize the different types of the way that these things can be called in. We talk about the shooting a lot, but a lot of times these start with a vehicle-borne attack. Somebody runs into a crowd with a vehicle and then gets out and starts shooting. Or it starts with a suspicious person with a gun call that as soon as you get information that, hey, this doesn't sound or look right because of the way these calls are coming in, the dispatchers working with each other, having a supervisor step in and say, no, this sounds like this is shaping up to be an active assailant type attack. Let's go ahead and hit the button for 10 law enforcement, 2 supervisors, a commander, and on the fire EMS side, the standard 4 engines, 4 rescue units, a chief, and all of those things that get toned out right from the start, because what has to go along with that is that you've had some training in advance. You know that those first arriving are going to form up contact team 1. Right behind them, contact team 2 is going to come in, and they're going to move towards the active threat. Tactical, triage, and transport are going to stay put and manage the follow-on responders. That your incident command on both the fire, EMS, and police side are going to establish a command post somewhere to start medical branch and start the law enforcement incident command. So there's just a lot going on, and the packages are good, but they have to go hand in hand with the training. Mm-hmm. And I think the data helps you understand the training.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and would you guys agree that it's probably important, again, from a responder point of view, that we take a broad look at the data that could touch this, not just one set of data or one set of reports. So, for example, where it can be a little misleading, when you look at the active shooter data, the stuff that is meets the definition for an active shooter event, it is a true statement to say over the last 5 years, school shootings are declining.
Yes.
However, when you look at a different data set that tracks gun violence in schools, the number of gun incidents in a school is steadily increasing over that same period of time. And you say, okay, well, wait a minute, why does that really matter? Well, here's why it matters. If a kid takes a gun to school and fires it, accidentally, on purpose, shoots himself, shoots somebody else, shoots the wall, but a gun has been fired in school, that is going to trigger a response, is it not?
Right, absolutely.
And you guys are, what are we thinking? Yeah. We get dispatched to a school for a shooting in progress.
Here it is. Yeah, here it is.
Right?
It is. Yep.
Everybody's mind, whether active shooter was mentioned on the radio or not, is irrelevant. Everybody's mind just clicked into that mode, did it not?
What if? What if?
Yeah.
So, but I think, so it's funny. There's very much a balance here. There's a bookend that we're talking about, is that the initial response should be a disciplined package that meets a definition that everyone knows their role when they arrive. And it's going to be a sequence of things. It's, not the same officers are not going to always be the first ones to get there, driving distance, everything else. So everyone has to have this disciplined response. And exactly what definition it fits doesn't matter at that moment. However, once you get in there with your disciplined response and your early intelligence is telling you that this was a kid who brought the gun from school, we got him, we got the gun, he says he did it on accident, that you're just as adept at toning down your response and bringing it back down to a reasonable level and getting everyone back on the same page, right?
Mm-hmm. That is you hit the nail on the coffin, toning down the response. Depending on what we already got with the information, do we elevate the response or do we start toning down the responses because we found out the information from the intelligence? And that's one of the important things that, with these events that we have to be aware of. What's the additional information do we have as we're responding to these calls? Because everybody, like you mentioned, it's a school shooting. Everybody thinks active shooter. Everybody's going 100 miles a minute to get there. But all of a sudden we get additional information. Dispatch tells us, hey, the child accidentally brought it in. Hey, let's tone down. Is that, needs to, okay, let's tone down the response now and go non-emergency, get there and work out the situation.
And then following on to that, how important is it that we as responders have the self-discipline to follow the procedures, to do what we're told to do, to stay on that task. And when we're told, we can de-escalate this thing, we actually have the self-control to bring that adrenaline back down.
Right.
Put it in check.
Yeah. How important is that?
It's very important. You're going to get everybody that's going to want to go. You're going to get guys that aren't listening to the right channel. They got it through cell phone, some kind of text message, however their notification to the event was, and then how can we weaponize that information and put it out? It's like, okay, hey, we got it under control. We don't need 75 cops here. What we need is 7 here to handle this. We don't need to flood it with this. But we also have to be ready for when we do need that. 75 is not going to handle it. Right. We're going to need 125. I'm just giving numbers out. Mm-hmm. So it's that first wave of information. Let's hope for the worst. Let's hope for the best, but plan for the worst kind of thing. We're planning for it, and do we need to keep going on forward with that plan, or can we backtrack it, scale it to what it actually is? It was an example here of incidental or accidental discharge, negligent discharge inside the structure. A kid wanted to show it off, be it intentional or unintentional discharge of the gun towards somebody, whatever that was. But we're already thinking for the worst. Mm-hmm. That's what's going to happen unless we tell them, whoa, we got it. It's not the worst. It's not that bad. So.
And isn't it also, I mean, if we don't have the discipline, the self-discipline to control our movements and tone it down, we end up with the ability to unintentionally escalate the event. There was a really, really notorious case study that we look at and talk about on a fairly regular basis, where the initial few officers were running with their weapons drawn through a very populated space. They were quite a distance away from where the shooting had occurred, and the shooter were dispatched almost immediately. Mm-hmm. I mean, in less than 60 seconds, the thing was done.
Right.
But for minutes that followed, we had officers, weapons out, in their hand, running and sprinting through very public places that caused a reaction.
Right. So I think that's what the data tells me, is that these things can look like a lot of different situations, which means that we can train for the worst case scenario, but we need to realize that these things are resolved in a wide variety of different ways, which should educate us to the idea that we need to get in there, do what we're trained to do, but then have the discipline to trust our initial intelligence, trust what our eyes and ears are seeing, trust what our witnesses are telling us, and that we can say we got this under control. We can use tools in the toolbox like, tactical guiding resources, staging, guiding some resources, command having the authority to say we are done. And I sometimes, when I'm speaking to law enforcement groups, a first-year sergeant does this really well. Mm-hmm. They go to a car crash, and if the car crash ends up with a person trapped and it's more complicated, they call for some additional units. If they get there and there's 5 officers there and they just need one person to right the crash and one to handle the tow, they tell the other 3 to get back in service, go away, go back to work, right? We do resource management really well, but then sometimes, because we call it an active shooter, we end up kind of losing our minds a little bit, and we get kind of way off track. But I think that's changing. And again, I think that's where data is really good for training and identifying the types of situations you can face, but then actually getting in there and doing some exercises and understanding when you respond, that to have the discipline to trust and do what you need to do and do what you're seeing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the message that I would say is looking at data is crucial. It's part of your job responsibility. You can't just look in one place, though. You need to fully understand what the data is that you're looking, what it represents, what it doesn't represent, and then look at other sources and say, from my perspective as a responder, not as a PhD researcher, but as a responder, what information am I going to have at time of dispatch? What's that going to sound like? Right. And how should I react accordingly? And then what data sets can help inform that? And so for our listeners, if you haven't seen this report, it's about 50 pages long from the FBI and Alert. Mm-hmm. Great report, some great data and studies in here. We will put a link to it in the show notes. We also have a couple of one sheets that we've put together that are just summaries of some of the key highlight items. We'll also link to those in the show notes as well. Final thoughts, Adam?
Trust what you're seeing. The situation will evolve. It's good to train up front, but trust what you're doing when you get on scene.
Kobe, final thoughts.
Doesn't matter how the injury got there. They're injured. Treat it as you need to. Deal with the problem as you see fit.
Juan?
And giving a size up, letting everybody know what you see, what you hear, so that way we could up the response or tone down the response.
And I think for me, just remember, it's from your perspective as a responder. What matters is what it sounds like when it came out over the radio, and then what you actually find on the ground when you get there. And the rest of it should be informed by that. Right. Thank you guys for talking about this. Interesting topic. Data can be somewhat of a boring topic, but I think there's really, really great information in here.
Doubt on it, sure.
For those of you that are listening, if you haven't liked and subscribed to the podcast, please do so. If you have some questions or comments, we're always happy to field those. Please feel free to shoot them our way. Thank you to our producer, Carla Torres, for making us look and sound great as always. And until next time, stay safe.